Hari Om. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatara varisthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Do we have free will? And this is the question I wanted to explore in today's lecture. It's a very difficult question, and it's an age-old question. It's a question that's been asked by thinkers throughout the world for thousands of years. To give you an example, the Bhagavad Gita raises this question. In chapter 18, verse 61, there's a shloka, Ishvaraha sarvabhutanam riddeshejuna tishtati brahmayan sarvabhutani yantrarudhani maya, which means the Lord resides in each one of our hearts. And that Lord is making us, we think we're acting freely, but in fact, it's as if we're mounted on a machine. We're just cogs in a machine, and God is doing everything through us. We're just God's instruments. This is what that shloka says in chapter 18, 18.61. On the other hand, there are many shlokas in the Bhagavad Gita which again and again tell us that we should renounce sense pleasures, that we should think of God, that we should engage in different kinds of spiritual practices, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga. But this advice seems to presuppose that we have free will. See, if we have to engage in spiritual practice, if the text is telling us do this, don't do this, the assumption seems to be that we are free either to engage in sadhana or not to engage in sadhana. We are free to indulge in sense pleasures or not to engage in sense pleasures. So there seems to be a kind of contradiction between 18.61 of the Gita, which says that we don't have any free will. We think we have free will, but in fact God is the doer. God is making us do everything as if we're just cogs in a machine. And on the other hand, we should engage in spiritual practice. We should avoid sin, which seems to presuppose free will. So isn't this a contradiction? This is one of the fundamental questions that comes up for many sadhakas, spiritual aspirants, in many different religions. And you find a similar tension, a similar kind of apparent contradiction in the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. On the one hand, Sri Ramakrishna frequently taught that God alone is the doer. I don't know anything, I don't do anything, only the Divine Mother is talking through me, she's doing everything through me. I see that the Divine Mother alone acts in this world. Everybody thinks they act, but in fact God alone is the doer. One of his favorite songs was a song by Ram Prasad, Shokoli Tomar Ichha in Bangla, which means it's a song addressing God, the Divine Mother, and saying, everything happens by your will, O Mother. And there are some famous lines which he loved repeating. Ami jontro tumi jontri in Bangla, which means I am the instrument, you are the operator. You are acting, using me as an instrument. And Jemon korao timni kori, loke bhabe kore ami. This is a line from the song which means I act only as you make me act. But people think that they act freely. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But in fact, in reality, it's the Divine Mother who's acting through us, as if we're just puppets in the Divine Mother's hands. This is one of Sri Ramakrishna's favorite songs. It's one that he sang frequently. He would quote lines from it. In fact, one of his favorite prayers that he encouraged sadhakas, the people, his visitors, that he encouraged everyone to repeat is that one line, Ami jontro tumi jontri, I'm a mere instrument in your hands, O Mother. So on the one hand, Sri Ramakrishna frequently taught that God alone is the doer. On the other hand, he's very famous for insisting on the need for renunciation. He himself was a great sannyasi, couldn't even touch money. And he would tell others, you must renounce kama kanchana, lust and greed. We know this. And he would tell people, you have to sincerely engage in spiritual practices. You should think of God as much as you can. You should take the Lord's name. All these. You find that throughout the gospel. Again, the question comes up, just as the question came up in the case of the Bhagavad Gita, Isn't there a kind of tension or a contradiction between, on the one hand, saying that we have no free will, God alone is the doer, and on the other hand, you should actively engage in spiritual practices? We find the same kind of tension in both the Bhagavad Gita and in the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. So, I want to explore this question a bit more deeply today. How do we resolve this apparent contradiction between these two strains in the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna? And to begin, I wanted to read directly from the Gospel. This is a very important passage. He discusses the issue of free will in many places, but this is a place where, in one paragraph, he explains his views on free will and determinism in a very, very succinct and philosophically sophisticated way. So I'll read it slowly, and then for the rest of the lecture, I'll just be kind of unpacking this one paragraph. Sri Ramakrishna says, "It is God alone who does everything. You may say that in that case man may commit sin, but that is not true. If a man is firmly convinced that God alone is the doer and that he himself is nothing, then he will never make a false step. It is God alone who has planted in man's mind what the Englishmen call free will." This is very interesting, what the Englishmen call free will. The original Bangla is Shadhin Ichha, Swadhina Ichha. People who have not realized God would become engaged in more and more sinful actions if God had not planted in them the notion of free will. Sin would have increased if God had not made the sinner feel that he alone was responsible for his sin. Those who have realized God are aware that free will is a false appearance. In reality, I am the machine and God is the operator. Bostuto tini jontri ami jontro. That favorite line of his from the Ram Prasad song. I'm just an instrument in the hands of God. I am the carriage and God is the driver. So this is a very, very important passage. And there's a lot of philosophical depth and subtlety in this passage. So I want us to think about this in more detail. So what are the main points that Sri Ramakrishna is making? Number one, he insists that in fact, we don't have any free will. No free will at all. God alone is a doer. This is what's called in philosophy and theology theological determinism. Determinism means that we are not free, that some force determines everything we do. Theological determinism is a more specific kind of determinism. Theological, most of you know, means pertaining to God. So theological determinism is the view that God is the one who is determining everything that we do. We are not free. God does everything through us. God is the doer. So Sri Ramakrishna was clearly a theological determinist. That's what he says in the first sentence of this paragraph. It is God alone who does everything. This is theological determinism. But he goes further. He makes a number of other points relating to this. How do we know that that's true? There's so many different views on free will. Some people say there is free will. Some people say there's no free will. Some people say there's no free will, but there's no God also. Many scientists believe that there's no free will. But many of them don't believe in God. So there are many different kinds of determinism. So why should we believe Sri Ramakrishna when Sri Ramakrishna says God alone is the doer? Why should we believe that theological determinism is the true doctrine? Sri Ramakrishna says, I'm teaching you this not as an intellectual hypothesis. I'm teaching you this on the basis of my own direct spiritual experience. Anybody who realizes God will know the truth that God alone is a doer. This is also, he says again and again, he says, if a man is firmly convinced that God alone is the doer and that he himself is nothing, then he will never make a false step. That means that you have to realize God, then you will know the truth, that God alone is the doer. This is the second point that he's making. How do we know that we don't have free will and that God alone is the doer? Not through intellectual reasoning, not primarily through that, but through our direct spiritual experience. Then there are more points made in the same passage. Another thing is, many of us, when we hear this teaching, we feel the need to say, to frame an objection and to say, wait a minute. If God alone is a doer, and I have not realized God, most of us have not, some of you may have, then I could say, this is a great excuse for me to do anything I want. Let me enjoy life. Let me do as much sinning as I want. Right? This is a nice excuse. If I don't have any free will, it's an excuse to do anything I want. Why bother with all this trouble with sadhana and all these things and avoiding sin? This is the question that often comes up in the minds of sadhakas and even in the minds of philosophers. So Sri Ramakrishna responds to this by saying, I've already read it, but I'll just repeat it one more time. It is God alone who does everything. You may say that in that case people may commit sin, but that is not true. If one truly realizes God alone is the doer and I am the non-doer, then he will never make a false step. This means that if you really believe that God alone is the doer, you have already realized God. You're a Jivan Mukta. And if you are a Jivan Mukta, you are completely free from any evil samskaras. Because in order to realize God, you have to become completely pure. And you become an instrument of God. If you're an instrument of God, God will never make you commit sin. God is God. He's benevolent. He's all loving. So this issue does not arise. So this is the first part. Of course, there's more to this, and I want to, in the course of the lecture, I'll go further into this objection. There are still other aspects that I want to discuss. So this is another aspect, another form of the objection that comes up. So see, Sri Ramakrishna is saying that if you're a Jivan Mukta, if you have realized God, there's no danger of making a false step, which means you can never commit sin. But most of us are not God realized. We have not yet realized God. We're still sadhakas. We're trying to realize God, but we have not yet realized God. What about us? Couldn't we use this doctrine of theological determinism as an excuse for being lazy in our spiritual practices, for committing sin, all sorts of things? No, because Sri Ramakrishna adds a very important point. He says that even though in reality there is no free will, God has implanted in each of us, in all human beings who have not yet realized God, the illusion of free will. The illusion of free will. We must believe that we are free to act so long as we have not realized God. And God has knowingly implanted this illusion of free will in us. Why? Because Sri Ramakrishna says, if God had not put in us this belief that we are free, we would have committed even more sin. This world is already full of sin. We know that. Open a newspaper and you'll see that this world is full of sin. You see what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. But what Sri Ramakrishna is saying is that if we really knew that God alone is a doer, that we have no free will, we would be committing 10 times, 100 times more sin. This is what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. So God very wisely, as an omnipotent being, has decided that, no, it is better that most people not know the truth, that I alone am the doer, I meaning God, not me. And that they must believe that they are free. Why? Sri Ramakrishna's idea is, so long as we believe that we are free to act, we will feel morally responsible for our actions. I should do this, I shouldn't do that, right? I'll only feel morally responsible for my actions if I feel that I'm free to act in one way or another way, right? And it's on the basis of this feeling of moral responsibility that I will try to go on the right path, that I will try to engage in benevolent actions, helping other people, trying to be less selfish, trying to avoid sinful activities. This is the idea. So God has planted in us the illusion of free will so that we will feel moral responsibility for our actions. And it's because of that feeling of moral responsibility that we don't engage in so much sinning. Of course, there's still sin, but much less sin. And if we didn't believe that we were free, it would be a disastrous situation. And in another place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna elaborates this point further. He explains why the illusion of free will is so necessary in the day-to-day running of society. This is what he says. This is a quotation. He says, as long as a man has not realized God, he thinks he is free. Totokhon mono hoy amra shadhin. It is God himself who keeps this error in man. It's a mistake to believe that we are free, but God himself, God herself, if you think of her as Divine Mother, has kept this illusion of free will in us. Otherwise, sin would have multiplied. Man would not have been afraid of sin. There would have been no punishment for it. Punishment here in the Bangla is shasti. What is Sri Ramakrishna saying? See, if somebody goes into a store and steals a lot of expensive products and runs away and he's caught, what happens? He's brought to a court of law. If he's found guilty, what happens? He'll be put in jail for a few years. But the whole assumption behind this whole procedure, this whole legal procedure, the whole institution of justice and imprisonment and punishment, it's based on the assumption that that person, that thief, was free either to steal those items or to refrain from stealing those items. So at the very basis of the most fundamental institutions of society, the institutions of justice, of punishment, is this belief that we are free to act. This is what Sri Ramakrishna says. There would have been no punishment for sinful activities and for illegal activities if we did not have this illusion of free will in us. Now, then there's another thing. Many of you are devotees, many of you are initiated followers. Revered Ayon Maharaj was just here for a few days, so some of you may also have been initiated, or you've been initiated in the past. And I've been in the order now for about 12, 13 years. And what I found is, this question comes up frequently among monks, among devotees, followers of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. I asked some monks before about this question, and one of the common answers I got from not all monks, but some monks, it's a very interesting metaphor, which they tell me. They say, no, we have some free will, we have limited free will. And they say, and these people would tell me that Sri Ramakrishna would use the example of a cow tied to a post. And there's some length of rope, and that cow is free to roam about within the radius of that rope, but it can't go further because the rope will prevent it from going further beyond that radius. So it has limited free will. This is something I've heard many times from monks, from devotees. But if you study his teachings carefully, what I have found is that this is not Sri Ramakrishna's position. How do I know this? Let me read from a conversation in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna between Dr. Sharkar, this homeopathic doctor, Mahendralal Sharkar, a famous scientist, and Sri Ramakrishna. This Dr. Sharkar mentions this view. He says, I do not say that the will is absolutely free. Suppose a cow is tied with a rope. That cow is free within the length of that rope, but when she feels the pull of the rope, and then Sri Ramakrishna interrupts him. And Sri Ramakrishna says, Jodu Mullik, another devotee, Jodu Mullik also gave that illustration. Is it mentioned in some English book? This is what Sri Ramakrishna said. This is not Sri Ramakrishna's analogy. He's asking where did you find this metaphor? From some English textbooks, from British textbook. Look here, if a man truly believes that God alone does everything, that God is the operator and man the machine, then such a person is a Jivan Mukta. And then he quotes the Ramprasad song, the favorite song of his. Thou workest thine own work, men only call it theirs. Jamon karao temni kori. O Divine Mother, you are the one acting through everybody. But people foolishly think that they are themselves acting. So Sri Ramakrishna is refuting this position that is commonly attributed to Sri Ramakrishna. It's very funny in the gospel. This is not Sri Ramakrishna's view, that we have limited free will, that we're like cows tied to a post with a certain length of rope, that we cannot go further. He says, no, we have absolutely no free will, 0% free will, not 1% or 5%, but 0. Okay, now, many of you are very critically minded, and I'm sure you'll have more questions to ask about Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will. Another question that commonly comes up is what I would call the problem of colliding standpoints. Remember I mentioned that so far I've mentioned two standpoints. One is the standpoint of the unenlightened person, the person who has not yet realized God. According to Sri Ramakrishna, God has knowingly implanted in unenlightened people the illusion of free will, so that they feel morally responsible for their actions, so that they don't commit so much sin. But there's a second standpoint, the standpoint of the God-realized soul. People like Sri Ramakrishna or Swamiji or so many other great saints in different religious traditions, they have realized God, and they know that they have no free will, but they are incapable of committing sin because they have realized God and they're instruments in God's hands, and God cannot make anybody sin, right? This is the idea. But what happens when these two standpoints, the standpoint of the ignorant person and the standpoint of the Jivan Mukta, the enlightened, God-realized soul, what if they collide, they come into contact with each other? And in fact, we find that this is exactly what happens in many places in the gospel. Because Sri Ramakrishna is speaking to a room full of visitors, most of whom presumably have not realized God. They're sadhakas, most of them, of course. That's why they're coming to Sri Ramakrishna, but most of them have not realized God. But Sri Ramakrishna, you'll find again and again, is teaching them the highest truth, that God alone is a doer. He loved to sing the Ramprasad song, Ami Jontru, Tumi Jontri, I'm a mere instrument in the hands of God. Isn't there a danger there? When an enlightened soul teaches an unenlightened person, no, you're wrong in thinking that you have free will. In fact, the Divine Mother does everything and that you have no free will. That's another natural question that comes up for sadhakas, but even for anybody who has a kind of a philosophical inclination. They'll say, wait a minute, but there seems to be a problem here. Why would Sri Ramakrishna teach such a dangerous truth to ordinary people who have not yet realized God? And this is where it gets very interesting. Because one of Sri Ramakrishna's visitors, a follower of the Brahmo Samaj, he asked this question. He says, if it is God that makes me do everything, then I am not responsible for my sins. This is the question. This is in the gospel. Then what is Sri Ramakrishna's response? And Mohandas Gupta, the author of Kathamrita, he adds, he says, with a smile. So Sri Ramakrishna knows this is a very clever question. With a smile, Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, Duryodhana also said that. He's quoting from the Mahabharata. O Krishna, I do what thou, seated in my heart, makest me do. This is Duryodhana is saying exactly this. He's saying, I can do anything I want because I know that Krishna is doing everything through me, so it's not my fault. It's Krishna's fault, whatever bad things I do. So Sri Ramakrishna quotes this from Mahabharata. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, if a person has the firm conviction, tik bishash in Bangla, that God alone is the doer and that he is his instrument, then he cannot do anything sinful. He who has learned to dance correctly never makes a false step. One cannot even believe in the existence of God until one's heart becomes pure. This is a very interesting response. And there's a lot of philosophical subtlety in what he's saying. So to give you some understanding of, a deeper understanding of what he's saying, I think it's helpful to bring in a particular concept from Western philosophy. It's a concept that's discussed now by many Western philosophers. It's called doxastic voluntarism. Doxastic is an adjective, it's a very fancy word, but doxastic just means of or pertaining to belief. Okay? And voluntarism, you know what voluntary means. It means you're voluntarily doing something. You're doing something because you want to, right? So the doctrine of doxastic voluntarism is just the view that I can choose to believe in something if I want to. Take a simple example. What if I say, I want to believe that Mysore is the capital of India? Can any of you just try to believe that? Try to believe that Mysore is the capital of India. Can you succeed? Will any of you succeed? No. Right? The idea is that philosophers say doxastic voluntarism is not a philosophically tenable position. It doesn't make sense. You cannot just decide to believe something unless you have a very good reason for believing it. So they reject this view. They say that doxastic voluntarism is false. So the opposite view is called doxastic involuntarism. It means that we cannot just form a belief in something because we feel like it. That's not the way that beliefs work, you know? So now let's try to apply that to what Sri Ramakrishna said in response to this follower of the Brahmo Samaj. What I think Sri Ramakrishna is saying, remember that last sentence. He says, one cannot even believe in the existence of God until one's heart becomes pure. This is a very startling statement. Most of us think that we all believe in God. Most people who follow a particular spiritual tradition based on a God, we think that, yeah, of course, we're sadhakas, we have not realized God, but we believe in God. But Sri Ramakrishna, and even Swamiji says the same thing. Swamiji in one place, he says, so long as we have even a single desire, worldly desire in our heart, we don't believe in God. But you might think this is Swamiji saying something extreme as usual, but no, Sri Ramakrishna says the same thing. One cannot even believe in the existence of God until one's heart becomes pure. What Sri Ramakrishna means is, belief is not such an easy thing. That belief has to well up from within, from the depths of our soul. And it can only well up in the heart, in a very, very pure heart that has been purified through spiritual practices and purified through God's grace. This is Sri Ramakrishna's idea. What to speak of the belief that God is a doer? You see, believing that God exists at all is a very high state. Most of us, in fact, are not believers, but we're trying to believe. As sadhakas, we're trying to believe that God exists. We're trying our best. And that's why we're engaging in spiritual practices. We're doing japa and dhyana and prayer and so many other spiritual practices. The next stage in our spiritual evolution will be when we believe in God, but that will not be a voluntary thing. That'll be by God's grace. Then that belief will spontaneously arise in our hearts when we become sufficiently pure. This is what Sri Ramakrishna says. Even further than that is the stage of God realization. After believing in God and we continue to call on God with great vyakulata, with great longing and sincerity, ultimately by God's grace we realize God. It goes even beyond belief, and then we realize that God is a doer. And then alone can we firmly believe that God is the doer. So why did Sri Ramakrishna respond with a smile to this follower of Brahma Samaj? Because he said, basically Sri Ramakrishna is saying, just try to believe that God is a doer. Let's see how far you go. This is why, just try, go ahead. Act now as if God is a doer. And you'll find you'll fail miserably. Because until you have realized God, you cannot truly believe that God is a doer. So this doesn't work. This route of, let me say that God is a doer and do anything I want, it doesn't work. You have to believe that you are free so long as you have not realized God. This seems to be Sri Ramakrishna's position. And I wanted to end by pointing out that there's a further complication in Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will. So far I've mentioned two standpoints. The standpoint of the agyani, the ignorant person, the unenlightened person who has not yet realized God. Those people, God has implanted in those people the illusion of free will so that they feel morally responsible for their actions, so that they won't commit so much sin. Second standpoint is the standpoint of the Jivan Mukta, the one who has realized God, who is liberated while living, and that person knows that God alone is a doer, but because that Jivan Mukta is an instrument in God's hands, that person is incapable of committing any sin. But Sri Ramakrishna introduces a third standpoint. He calls this person the Vijnani. I've discussed the Vijnani in other lectures, but I'll just mention it briefly here. He says that there is a certain soul called an Ishvarakoti, a divinely commissioned soul. People like Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna and other avatars like Chaitanya, these are Ishvarakotis. They're portions of the divine. He says that they attain an even greater spiritual realization even than the Jivan Mukta. What is that realization? He says that the Vijnani sees that God alone has become everything in this world. The 24 cosmic principles, Choturbingshi Tattva. There's nothing but God. Everyone in this audience, me, even this table, every single thing in this world is a different manifestation of God. From that standpoint, from the Vijnani standpoint, so the number one standpoint is Agyani, who has the illusion of free will. Number two is the standpoint of the Jivan Mukta, or the God-realized soul, who knows that God alone is a doer. The third standpoint is the standpoint of the Vijnani, who has identified with God, because he knows, or he or she knows, that there's nothing but God in this world. And the only truly free being is God. We think we're free, but we're not free. God alone is free. But because God has become everything, and the Vijnani has realized that God has become everything, this Vijnani can actually participate in God's freedom. This is the beauty of the Vijnani standpoint. The Vijnani is free because the Vijnani knows that there's nothing but God, and that God is the only free being in this world. So this is a third standpoint. So keep in mind these three standpoints when you think about, as a sadhaka, what are Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will? Remember that you should be very careful about what standpoint you are asking that question from. As sadhakas, as people who are striving to realize God but who have not yet realized God, we must believe that we are free. And this is not just we should randomly believe this, but God is making us believe that we are free for our own spiritual welfare and for our own moral welfare. That's the very important thing. But we should ultimately try to attain a spiritual state when we realize that God alone is a doer. That's the idea. And I wanted to mention one nice example of a sadhaka who, through this practice of saying, of constantly thinking, Ami jontro, tumi jontri, that God alone is a doer, I'm a mere instrument, that person actually attained God realization. Many of you can guess this, but Girish Ghosh. It's a very interesting case of somebody who led a very, very worldly existence for many years and then discovered Sri Ramakrishna. And there's a beautiful incident when Sri Ramakrishna Girish Ghosh says, he was full of faith and devotion, and he said to Sri Ramakrishna, what should I do? And Sri Ramakrishna said, just take the Lord's name twice a day. once when you wake up, again before you go to bed. Girish Ghosh, he was an honest person, so he said, I can't do that. I'm too lazy and I don't have a strict routine. I can't promise you that I'll be able to take the Lord's name twice a day. Then he said, okay, just take the Lord's name once a day before going to bed. That'll be enough. He said, I can't even promise that. Who knows what my schedule is? At that time, he was addicted to alcohol. There were so many problems. He said, I can't promise that either. Then Sri Ramakrishna smiled. He said, okay, then give me the power of attorney. Give me the power of attorney. What does that mean? Girish Ghosh was very excited. He thought that it meant that, okay, I don't have to do anything. Sri Ramakrishna will do everything for me. This is the best of both worlds. We don't have to do anything and we'll attain God realization just because Sri Ramakrishna will be doing everything for me. So Girish Ghosh said, I'm off the hook. Sri Ramakrishna will do everything. But no, that's not what happened. It was the most difficult sadhana. How do we know this? Because Girish Ghosh, many years later, many years after Sri Ramakrishna left his body, he was visiting Belumat and he told some of these monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, I thought that when I gave the power of attorney to Sri Ramakrishna that my life would be very easy and very smooth sailing. The opposite is true. He said, what I found is that at every moment I have to feel, the practice is to feel that God is working through me. And he gave an example. He said, when I lift up my arm, I have to actually feel that it's Thakur, it's Sri Ramakrishna who's lifting up my arm, that I'm not lifting up my arm. He said, how difficult this practice was, I only realized later. So don't think that this is a very easy practice, but Sri Ramakrishna, why did he teach? Remember, we're coming back to that same question. Why did Sri Ramakrishna teach what I called before such a dangerous truth? That we have no free will, that we are only instruments in the hands of God, that God alone is a doer. The reason is because that becomes a kind of spiritual practice. That through this, he's already started. Okay, so by constantly telling ourselves that we are not the doer, that God alone is the doer, we slowly chip away at our self-will. Slowly and gradually we erode our egoism, our selfishness, our selfish tendencies, our tendencies toward worldly enjoyments. And so that's a way to make spiritual progress. If we are of a certain kind of temperament, not all of us are like Girish Ghosh. You have to have tremendous faith and devotion. Not everybody, so Sri Ramakrishna didn't tell everybody to do that, to believe that kind of thing. And remember, belief, not that Girish Ghosh believed from the beginning that God is a doer. I already mentioned that Sri Ramakrishna said that that's not possible. We can't just decide to believe that God is a doer. That comes after many years of spiritual practice. That's also what Girish said. Only after many years of sadhana can I really say that I believe that God is a doer. But as a sadhaka, Girish Ghosh from the beginning tried to believe that God is a doer by constantly reminding himself, I'm not the one raising my arm, I'm not the one doing this, I'm not the one composing my plays. God alone is a doer. And slowly but surely, he reduced his egoism and ultimately realized God. So let us pray to the holy trio, Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother Sharada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda, that each one of us, through spiritual sadhana and through God's grace, will realize this great truth that God is a doer and realize God in this very life. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.